Hi, I'm Sharon Small with the Clean Language Institute, and I'm here with Jacqueline Ann Sarin. And she has a chapter in the newly published book, Clean Language Interviewing. I have to look at the title because it's quite long. Principles and Applications for Researchers and Practitioners. So, hi, Jacqueline, welcome, and thank you for meeting me today.
Hi, Sharon. Thank you for asking me along for this interview.
Yeah, so I know this is about clean interviewing, but I have to say I'm very curious. How did you get involved in this project for this book on clean language interviewing particularly?
I think that's a great question because what happened was before I got involved in clean language, so I am a certified clean facilitator and coach, and I do both professional facilitation as well as professional coaching. And I also train in clean. But before I got into clean training and clean language, I was a journalist for over 20 years. I was an award-winning journalist in Malaysia where I live. And I ran my own newsroom. So I have a background of interviewing that comes from my many years in journalism and having run my own newsroom and training younger journalists, right, to do interviews as well. And then I started training in clean language. And one of the strands or schools or branches of clean language is clean language interviewing. And I started getting trained in clean language interviewing. And then when James, Heather, and Paul were thinking of this book idea, James invited me to contribute a chapter on clean language interviewing within the area of journalism. And so that's how I got involved in this book. And that's what my chapter is about. It's about clean interviewing within the context of a journalistic interview.
Okay. And as a journalist, what kind of interviews did you do before you learned clean language?
So I was at the news desk predominantly. So that was the daily news reporting kind of work that I was doing. But I was also across different beats, right? So I used to do environment, politics, business, foreign policy, parliament. So the kinds of reporting mostly were like day-to-day things. So something would break in the news, would go after, say, a CEO or a politician or a community leader to ask them questions about this thing that had just happened, So what happened? How many people were affected? What are you going to do about it? Who was involved in it? That kind of like doorstop. A lot of times it was door stopping kind of interviews.
Okay.
We'd turn up at the event where the person was, and then would, in a sense, catch them.
So that's a door stopping interview.
Yeah. And
You
of course
turn up and you catch them. Okay.
catch them.
Yeah.
Because they weren't always willing.
Yeah. Yeah.
A lot of them tried to squirm and run and, avoid the media. But there were also, of course, instances where it was a press conference. So, they had set it up and we would turn up and then we would ask these questions. I, of course, also did quite a lot of feature profile pieces as I became a more seasoned writer. I used to do book reviews, or movie reviews, those kinds of things. So anything that goes in, I was in a newspaper, so anything that goes into the newspaper, I very likely have done all of those kinds of different reportings.
Okay. And so like a press conference, that would be the same or different to the kind of press conference we might see on TV, just to get a feel for.
It would be the same.
The same. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So those things you see on TV, that was my life for 20 years.
Wow. Okay. Okay. So that's a kind of interviewing that most of us watching this would understand. And in your chapter, it's the potential of clean language interviewing for journalists. And so tell us a little bit more about your particular chapter and what you found as a result of doing this particular piece.
So because in journalism, there's kind of like different kinds of situations, right, in which my journalistic skills are called upon to get information, to reveal something, to increase public understanding about a particular issue. And it was impossible for me to recreate all of those different situations for a chapter that wasn't supposed to be longer than 4,000 words. Plus, I am no longer a journalist. So I am today a full-time professional coach and an expert facilitator, and I do training on communication skills and on clean language. So I no longer occupy that space where I am on a daily basis going out to interview people for a newspaper.
And press conferences.
And press conferences.
And
and
door
I no
stopping.
And door
Okay.
stopping, yeah.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So I had to think about, like, how could I do a project? How could I do a piece of research that would fit all of the criteria, including the word limitation? And so what I decided to do was to just take a very thin slice of what I used to do as a journalist. And that was to do a profile piece interview. So essentially finding a figure or personality whose life, whose work was interesting enough or would be useful for readers to learn about, and then doing a profile interview with that person, and then using just clean or cleanish questions for that interview as a way to compare that with how I might have done it before I learned clean interviewing. But doing it at two levels. So one was a comparison of what using clean language interviews did for me. And my interviewee happened to be a journalist. He was my deputy news editor before when I ran my own newsroom. So he's a journalist, an activist, and an academic in his own right. So because he was a journalist before, and because he's been interviewed numerous times by different media, I was also able to ask him to compare his experience of being interviewed by me with clean questions, compare that with other interviews he had in the past where he was being interviewed, where journalists weren't using clean interview questions just because they don't know about it or they're not trained in it. So there were two levels of comparisons. One was me, what it was doing for me, and then the other, what was it doing for him as the interviewee.
And he was somebody who had experience being interviewed and experience doing interviews himself.
That's right. Yeah.
Correct?
So in many ways, he was the ideal interviewee for this chapter, just because he had those experiences that he could compare and contrast against.
Great. And what was your experience, or what kind of, you say clean and cleanish. So and I'd say that you and I are probably doing a little clean and cleanish right here, since we talked a little bit before our time about where we might like to go or what we might like to have happen during this chat about your chapter. What did you find as a result of working with this person who had prior experience to do some compare and contrast with, about clean language interviewing, particularly in this domain, as a profile piece, as an example?
So the first was kind of just what it was doing for me, and what I did after the interview I had conducted with him, and I did two interviews with him. One interview was about his life as an activist, so what were the things that kept him being an activist? What does he do when there are obstacles? So that was the first interview. And right after that first interview, I did a second interview with him, again using clean interviewing techniques, where I asked him, so what happened for you, or what was the impact of you when you heard me asking those questions? And that second interview was really revealing for me, because I got I had the opportunity to find out what was going on for him internally, which we never normally get a chance to do when we're interviewing somebody. And he said that actually he was quite anxious, and feeling a bit stressed out about the interview, which was really surprising to me, just because we both are friends. We both had a professional relationship before. He is not somebody who's new to media interviews, but he revealed to me that there was anxiety and there was stress involved. But after the first few questions, he realized that actually he was going to be okay, and that he didn't have to perform. So part of the anxiety was thinking that he needed to perform because it was a media interview. And then he realized, actually, Jacqueline doesn't have any expectations of me. She's just taking what I've said and asking me a question about what I've just said. And it was giving him a space for him to deepen and to explore what was going on for him with regards to that question, and then to deepen his own answer as he was answering it. And then eventually he just kind of like didn't feel the need to perform to an expectation that I hadn't placed on him. It hadn't, it was happening within his own system. So just his ability to, release that and go, oh, okay, this really is, and he used these words, this really is a two-way interview where he felt as much in control of the narrative. He knew that I was the one who had convened the interview. And in some ways, I had the power to decide what questions to ask. But that didn't make him feel like it was a one-way interview. So I think it's that sharing of power that was happening for him. Yeah. And the impact on him was, for me, it sounded quite profound, that he was able to have that kind of experience so quickly within the interview, when he had started the interview with so much of this, like, oh, I need to perform, what do I need to say, all of those things. And the questions allowed him to put those things aside and go, hey, I can just be me, and it's absolutely fine. Yeah.
Right.
So
And that second interview was really revealing
yeah.
to you. And when it was really revealing to you, what do you know now about using clean language questions in a journalistic interview that you may not have known before you did this project?
I think that specifically, and I'm going to speak specifically to the profile piece kind of interviews,
Yes.
that it really, like using clean language interviews, well, number one, it releases me, right, of having to hold any fixed narratives. So that's the other impact that doing the interview had on me, right? I needed to, of course, understand what I was after in the interview, and I needed to know a little bit about the personality. So the first thing is, of course, like, I don't need to hold a fixed narrative. Like, I can trust that the narrative will come from the person I'm interviewing. And for a profile piece, that's going to be really rich and authentic and true, because it's going to come from the interviewee. It's not going to come from me. So I can trust that I'm not imposing any of my own fixed narratives, which may or may not be accurate, because, we are all prone to interpretations and assumptions. So I can trust that my interview will do justice to the life of this person, because the person is actually the one who is going to be in charge of authoring the narrative that's going to appear in my writing. So and I think back about the interviews that I've done before, and I've done many, many profile interviews over the course of my 20 years. And yeah, I would come with, like, I would have a fixed narrative, right? We used to call it an angle in the newsroom. So what's your angle? And I would have an angle, and I would use that angle in my interview questions. And the interviewees wouldn't know any differently, that was what was going on in my head, and that was what I was angling for. And sure, some interviewees would push back because they weren't prone to being, in some ways, persuaded or worse, manipulated in that way. But other interviewees might just go along with my angle. And then that raises the question of, how authentic is this story that's being told, and how much of it is actually my story, because my angle is already in the story, in the way that I question, in the way that I'm using my questions.
Already in the questions. Yeah. Okay, so for a nice classic clean question ending, writing this chapter was like what?
Writing this chapter was like it was really tough.
Mm,
It was
yeah,
really tough because I'm not in academia, and having to write an academic paper requires a particular kind of rigor. And it's not like I can't do it. I've done academic papers before, but I haven't done one in a long time. So writing this chapter it was a slog.
a slog,
It
a
was
slog.
really a slog. And it was
Uh,
a slog also because we were doing it during the pandemic and I was
yeah,
at home alone. I don't have colleagues or peers that I can, check in with, or yeah. So it was a slog. And I kept at it. I kept at it because I made a promise
mhm,
to James, who had invited me to write this chapter. And I kept at it because of my love for both journalism and for clean language,
yeah.
and definitely clean interviewing. So I do have a deep passion for both, and I do have a deep commitment to putting both out into the world because I know it's made a difference in
Yeah.
my life. So even though it was a
So
slog, I
so
kept
when it
at
was a
it.
slog,
Yeah.
yeah, and you kept with it because you have a deep passion, right? And the chapter has been published. The
I
book
know.
is
It's
now
shocking.
in print.
It's just shocking.
Yeah. So what's happening now with
I'm glad it's out there. I mean, but I think after I was done with the chapter and after all the, T's were crossed and the I's were dotted, I kind of
yeah.
like, I can't deal with this anymore. So I kind of, I know the book is published and I know it's cause for celebration and all of those things, but I really cannot think about it because of the slog that was involved in writing it. Yeah.